When we think of Omega watches, more often than not, our attention is immediately pushed towards models like the Seamaster. Within the line, the Professional 300, the Aquaterra, the Planet Ocean, the Ploprof. Then there is the Speedmaster line with its millions of references. And then the more unique but obscure Railmaster. The trilogy of these pieces have defined the Omega name for almost 2 generations at this point. But before they were unveiled in the late 50s, really made popular, the Constellation was the cover girl. An elegant, simple dress watch. Some models balancing details like the now iconic shark's teeth indices, Dauphine hands, simple or complex lugs of various forms, and one of the most unique and the one characteristic that really made the watch instantly recognizable, a pipe hand dial. Small note. When I was slowly getting into this hobby, I never understood the name when it was mentioned by enthusiasts. The words said so fast can sometimes be mistaken for pipe hand dial, and that's what I thought the name meant. So to clarify, a pipe pan, the name literally stems from how the dial has been pressed outwards, giving off the same effect that we would see if a pan was resting on its face. And if you know what vintage fluted pipe pans look like, you get the idea. How collectors and enthusiasts come up with these names, we will never know. But it is charming and unique to the line. There is a great amount of symbolism tied to the Constellation. A successor to a model that was introduced to celebrate a century of the Omega name. It was a watch that was introduced with a perpetual movement, and throughout its history has been a watch that boasts to hold a top-tier caliber, brandishing Geneva's observatory as a symbol on its caseback. And the whole idea of linking celestial movement with the precision of timekeeping and holding to a high standard is how the Constellation developed, bearing the one detail that tied all the watches together in the family, a small, applied, 5-pointed star at the base of the dial. We saw 2 clear developments from the early 50s until the early 60s, and then from the early 60s to the late 70s. Now, the early Constellations from the late 50s are models that many of us can relate to. When you close your eyes, you can imagine the aggressive shark's teeth batons, pipe hand dials, curvaceous lugs, some with pole router-esque dividing lines that runs through like a crosshair through the dial and all the quarters. The lugs on these watches really defined the era. We could say that they were Art Deco inspired, almost looking semi-detached from the case, with flares that stood proud. In a way, these sharp elements paired neatly with the batons on the dial. And this sumptuous styling was what made these Constellations appealing at the time. Since they were some of the best watches that Omega offered, of course they needed to exhibit some kind of exuberant quality. As the watches transitioned to the 60s, their designs became more restrained. Some kept the 50s elements, but the models look far more timeless and less dated. The pieces that collectors love simply are more effective because they are spare of detail. So because of that, the watches cannot be placed in a specific time period. With a more elegant approach with baton placement, the lugs became slimmer, more profiled. And we could say that these models were moving from being statements, ones that really stood out on the wrist, into watches that were more casual and understated, refined. The real transition happened in the late 60s, when we started seeing the Constellation come into its own, for the era at least, when it adopted quite a dynamic cushion case, turning it into an archetype of the early 70s, and with the addition of a fluted bezel. Now yes, we could say that the Constellation never really had a clear design language to begin with. It does seem like the inspirations changed as the time periods did, and we see this as quite a common trend shared between many watch names back then, because nothing was definite. Watches were made to be sold, and there was no thought about just how long their designs would endure. Companies just abided by the styling of the times, following what was fashionable. Thankfully, nowadays, that practice has changed somewhat. And we saw this development into the 80s, where the Constellation received an integrated case and bracelet treatment. These models deserve their own video in the near future, because there is a lot to discuss when we look at their styling and just how they have transitioned into the 21st century, and how Omega has made them still an important addition in their catalogue. Where the external aesthetic designs of the Constellation changed drastically, the movements continually were improved, from bumper movements to calibers with beryllium balance bridges, many jewels, super flat movements, all of which were adjusted and set to chronometer standards. So as timekeepers, they remained state-of-the-art and continued to get better and more accurate over the decades. In 2015, the Globemaster arrives. Many were blown away by its release, and after seeing the brief history of how the Constellation line developed, immediately you will see that it is a watch that pays tribute to some of the best stylistic choices that were put into the originals. And the great irony is that, individually, the original Constellations didn't really follow a clear language, but the Globemaster has created an almost definitive, timeless aesthetic using those original elements in different places. When we consider the movement, the 8900, it is Omega's most advanced, top-tier coaxial caliber. Beyond COSC certification, it is METAS regulated, which was newly introduced with this watch. 39 joules, twin-barreled, 60-hour power reserve, tested in 6 positions, exposed to all the magnetism, temperatures, and reasonable water pressures. So in keeping with what made the original Constellations famous, the Globemaster houses one of the greatest modern Omega calibers ever made. You don't have to be an enthusiast to know just how great these movements are, and that is a big selling point. Reliability, superior timekeeping, and a long life. And there are few who can deny that this is a gorgeous looking watch. A distillation of ideas shared over 60 years. We see the 5-pointed star at the base of the dial, an understated pie-pan effect that goes virtually unnoticed. A 60s-inspired dial with stick batons that pair with a fine tungsten fluted bezel, and case shape that is reminiscent of the 70s styling. It's a terrific marriage of elements. Looking at the clear caseback, we see the Geneva Observatory medallion in the center, with 8 stars, representing 8 tests that the movement is subjected to under METAS scrutiny. The bracelet blends seamlessly with the case, with no polishing. Notice the added material between the case and the lugs to hide the spacing when the strap is added. Then the styling of the bracelet, a very close construction to a look that is reminiscent of 50s and 60s era bracelets that made Omega sports watches famous. And it is that sheer level of detail that follows through every area with the watch case and dial. The profile on the wrist, the spare use of polishing, the applied logo and elegant script used for the Globemaster text underneath, the date window in the center, thin fluting on the bezel and how it matches the fluting on the crown. When looking at the annual calendar, seeing just how the text has been used on the dial with a separate hand, and the varying materials used, whether in two-tone, full Sedna gold, models with black, white, grey, blue, sunburst dials. So then it's questioning where this model lies. Does it line up with the Rolex Datejust, for example? Of course it is competing with the model, and it is a much more defined watch, looking to be one that lines up more directly with a dressier aesthetic. And when we see this watch next to the Aquaterra, they do stylistically look very different. So yes, the Globemaster is going after the Datejust, but it's like comparing apples and oranges at the end of the day. The Datejust invented the rotating date window. It has a gargantuan historical significance. On a historical front, the Datejust has it. But I believe that the Globemaster is more of an enthusiast watch, only for those who enjoy the idea that they are wearing an extremely well-developed movement and an assortment of well-aligned components. It's another watch that manages to skirt under the radar to the casual observer, with nothing like a Cyclops lens to make it instantly recognizable. And then when we think about a setting where this watch would be suited, it sits in an area where it would work on all occasions, partly because of its non-polarizing styling and sporty bracelet. If we then move to the dressier models with day-date complications and leather straps, then we are looking at something more formal. What is seriously commendable is that the Globemaster, being a recently released model, has managed to find itself aligned with pieces that have been popular for decades. Very much like how the Vacheron Overseas now rubs shoulders with the Nautilus and the Royal Oak, the Globemaster is a watch that has forged its own path. For those who know watches and watchmaking, it houses an impressive movement. For those who enjoy a style that will now remain timeless and simple, with great inspirations and callbacks to pieces from years gone by, the Globemaster really encompasses all of those things. A beautiful tribute to decades of development, and undeniably a watch that has positioned itself among the pantheon of greats.